Okay, let's just start. People can file in later if they want. Okay, so I'm Dustin Atlas, Director of Jewish Studies at Queen's, and I want to welcome everyone to today's discussion of Heidegger and his Jewish Reception, the book by Daniel Herskowitz. Today's panelists are a lively and wonderful bunch of scholars. We've got Professors Elias Sacks, Vivian Liska, and Shira Billet, and of course, Daniel. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the panelists, hear a response from Daniel, a few minutes of panelist Thunderdome amongst themselves, and then open it up to questions. If you have any questions during the event, just you can chat them, text them to me, and I will put them at the forefront when we move into question time. I don't like talking, so we're going to move immediately to Elias Sacks. He's currently the director of the program in Jewish Studies and associate professor, also professor of religious studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And in January 2023, he's going to become the director of the Jewish Publication Society. And I am going to put a doc in the chat as per his request. And I'm assuming it's something that you can access for to follow.
It should be accessible to everyone, but if there are issues, please just let me know.
All right, so it's in chat if anyone wants to take a look at it during the presentation. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Dustin, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to my co-panelists. Thank you to all of you on Zoom, and most of all, thank you to Dr. Herskowitz for this insightful, learned, and provocative book. I'm really excited to be able to kind of think with you and your work today. So this book, if you have not yet read it, is a wonderfully rich text. And if we had more time, there are many strengths that we might highlight. First of all, this is a study that is both broad and deep, right? It covers a remarkably wide array of figures, from kind of the editors of interwar German Jewish newspapers to poets and scholars in British Mandate Palestine to philosophers such as Buber and Levinas. Impressively, though, this kind of treatment of a broad cast of characters is never superficial. Far from having to content ourselves with cursory summaries of these figures, we receive detailed treatments of the writings they composed and the historical context they inhabited. And I think that this points to another one of the book's many strengths. Just as we might consider the study's breadth and depth, we might also consider its methodological versatility. This is an impressive work of intellectual history. It moves seamlessly across interwar Germany, post-war America, late 20th century France, and many other settings. But it's also a sophisticated work of philosophical analysis. It attends to the details and to the logic and to the structures of the arguments it studies. Just to give a kind of few examples to give us a flavor, Herskowitz provides new categories for understanding Buber's thought, fresh insights into Leo Strauss's turn to medieval Jewish philosophy, nuanced comparisons between sort of folk or people talk in Rosenzweig, Heidegger, and others, and much more. There's a blend here of historical rigor on the one hand and philosophical musicality on the other that's all too rare. So there's a lot to praise here, though. Rather than simply try to highlight, though, the full range of the book's virtues, I instead want to focus on one particular strength, namely the way in which this book kind of paves the way for future studies, the way in which it raises questions for us to pursue going forward. And more specifically, I'd like to try to pose three questions that I think the book enables us to ask. A question about the story that the book tells, a question about the stories that the book doesn't tell, and a question about the lessons that the book offers. I'll try to take each of these in turn. Dustin has already put a Google Doc in the chat with some passages that we'll look at together, and I'll try to show these on the screen as well. So let me begin with my first question, my question about the kind of story that the book tells. And here I want to actually begin with Hershkowitz's own words, his own kind of summary of or overview of his argument. For those of you on the Google Doc, this should be the first passage, and I'll try to share it on my screen as well. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing something on the screen right now? Okay, amazing. So this is how Herskowitz summarizes his arguments. He says the Jewish engagement with Heidegger in the 20th century is rich and varied. Through a dialectic of attraction and repulsion, Jewish thinkers developed a version of Jewishness that sought to offer the way out of the overall crisis plaguing their world, which was embodied, as they saw it, in Heidegger's Life and Thought. Neither turning a blind eye to Heidegger's anti-Semitism, nor using it as an excuse for ignoring his philosophy, they came to grapple with Heidegger's existential analytic and diagnose where it had gone wrong in order to correct its philosophical and political errors, and while doing so, also to think through the place of Judaism and Jewish existence in the modern world. Perhaps ironically, then, Heidegger's thought proved itself to be fertile ground for reconceptualizing what it means to be Jewish. So this, I take it, is kind of the central argument of the book. And the argument here, I think, is twofold. So first, Herskowitz suggests that it was precisely by engaging Heidegger that a wide range of Jewish thinkers developed and articulated their own conceptions of Judaism and Jewishness. So kind of that's claim one. And claim two is that these conceptions or visions of Jewishness were often intended as antidotes or alternatives to some broader crisis or problem that plagues modernity, and in particular is embodied in Heidegger. So this is a compelling story, and it's persuasively narrated. It's also an original story that sheds genuinely new light, I think, on 20th century Jewish thoughts. And it's an important story that has broader implications to which we'll return. My question, though, is as follows. To what extent is it also a unique story? In particular, to what extent is the Jewish reception of Heidegger a unique episode within modern Jewish intellectual history writ large? Herskowitz points out that the vision of Judaism constructed in this episode, this vision of Judaism as a universally relevant antidote to modernity's ills, kind of has a long history in Jewish thought. However, kind of what I want to ask is sort of what about the engagement with Heidegger himself? To what extent is the Jewish reception of Heidegger's work similar to the Jewish reception of other controversial thinkers? And to what extent is the Jewish reception of Heidegger's work different from the Jewish reception of other figures? You know, the example that kept coming to mind for me as I was reading this book was Spinoza. Hershkowitz's preface has a sentence that briefly links interpretations and misinterpretations of Heidegger with interpretations and misinterpretations of Spinoza during the pantheism controversy, during this kind of important intellectual conflict in Germany at the end of the 18th century. And I kept wondering, you know, maybe the similarities run even deeper, right? So to what extent was Spinoza also someone whose work was utilized by diverse Jewish thinkers as an opportunity to present conceptions of Judaism and Jewishness? To what extent was Spinoza also someone who was seen as embodying flaws or problems to which Judaism might provide a cure? You know, could we even actually take Hershkowitz's words here and with just a few substitutions tell a story about Spinoza? You know, so could we say, for example, that the Jewish engagement with Spinoza in the 18th through 20th centuries is rich and varied? Through a dialectic of attraction and repulsion, Jewish thinkers developed a version of Jewishness that sought to offer the way out of the overall crisis plaguing their world, which was embodied as they saw it in Spinoza's Life and Thought. Neither turning a blind eye to Spinoza's hostility to Judaism, nor using it as an excuse for ignoring his philosophy, they came to grapple with Spinoza's Enlightenment thought and diagnose where it had gone wrong in order to correct its philosophical and political errors. And while doing so, also to think through the place of Judaism and Jewish existence in the modern world. Perhaps ironically, then, Spinoza's thought proved itself to be fertile ground for reconceptualizing what it means to be Jewish. So would this be a fair statement, right? Is Spinoza's role, is Heidegger's role in 20th century Jewish thought similar to Spinoza's role in earlier periods? What implications would follow from our answer? Right, if Heidegger does function as a sort of latter-day Spinoza, what might that tell us, right? Can the course of modern Jewish philosophy be narrated as a story where a confrontation with Spinoza gives way to a confrontation with Heidegger? Does this mean that this recurring dialectic of attraction and repulsion actually pervades and structures much of modern Jewish thoughts? And what should we make of that dynamic? Conversely, if Heidegger's role is not similar to Spinoza's, what are the differences? And what do they tell us about these thinkers in Jewish philosophy? What distinguishes Heidegger and his readers from Spinoza and his readers? And what might we learn from those gaps? So this then is the kind of first question I want to ask, right? To what extent is Hershkowitz's story unique? How should we situate the Jewish reception of Heidegger in relation to the Jewish reception of other controversial thinkers? And kind of just to be clear, I don't think that any one specific answer would be better or more interesting or more valuable than any other. We would learn quite a bit from discovering something qualitatively new in Heidegger's reception, just as we would learn quite a bit from being able to locate this narrative within a broader history of similar sorts of engagements. And I'll just add that I think we could ask similar questions about the non-Jewish reception of Heidegger. Herskowitz calls attention to striking similarities between themes and concerns that come up in Jewish readings of Heidegger on the one hand, and themes and concerns that come up in non-Jewish readings on the other. Kind of what should we make of that? To what extent is Heidegger's Jewish reception similar to his non-Jewish reception? And to what extent are there moves, dynamics, themes that distinguish the one from the other? And again, kind of what might we learn here about Jewish thought, about European intellectual history, and maybe about Heidegger himself? Okay, so that's my first question. My second question has less to do with the story that Hershkowitz's book tells, and more to do with the stories that his book doesn't tell. I suspect that there's only one person who thinks that this book fails to cover sufficient territory, and that's Herskowitz himself. So in his preface, he notes that there are other thinkers who don't appear in the study, but could have been considered. And in a note, he then cites by name Michael Wishegrad, Emil Fackenheim, Jakob Taubes, Susan Taubes, and Margareta Sussman. And he states that he hopes to address some of these omissions in future studies. Now, I think Herskowitz can cut himself some analytical slack here, right? There's only so much that one book can do. That said, because he raises this point, I want to ask a question. What if we take him up on his suggestion here? What might we learn if we were to consider some of the figures who don't make it into this study? Are there stories that have yet to be told, or kind of trajectories that have yet to be considered when it comes to Heidegger and Jewish thoughts? Just to cite kind of one example from the figures named above, what about Susan Taubes, a fascinating figure who I think is all too often and all too unjustly remembered primarily for her marriage to Jakob Taubes? So what should we make of the fact that Susan Taubes intended to write a dissertation on Heidegger, but then decided not to do so, and instead pursued a different topic? So many of Hershkowitz's figures just can't stop writing about Heidegger. What does it mean that Susan Taubes did? Or at least that she abandoned a project on his thoughts, even while still discussing him in other contexts? Is there a story to be told here, not just about Jewish thinkers who are preoccupied with Heidegger, but also about Jewish thinkers who attempt to overcome that preoccupation? Indeed, are there other news stories here as well? What about, say, the role of Heidegger in Susan Taubes's construction of Judaism? Many of Hershkowitz's figures draw on Heideggerian categories to make sense of Judaism. Some of them even go further and sort of detect affinities between aspects of his thought on the one hand and the Jewish tradition on the other. What's rare, though, is for the thinkers in this book to actually cast Heidegger as owing a debt to the Jewish tradition, as actually drawing ideas from Jewish sources. There are a few figures whom Hershkowitz discusses who make that sort of move. The most surprising one is or at least the most surprising one to me, was the liberal German Jewish rabbi Leo Beck, who claims that Heidegger enacts a kind of Jewish thinking. I think not the maybe words we expect to hear from Beck. In general, though, this isn't the sort of move that Hershkowitz's subjects make. And in fact, even when they link Heidegger to something that might seem Jewish, say to the Bible, they typically link him to Christian readings of those sources, to Christian readings of scripture. Susan Taubes, however, seems to make precisely this type of move, precisely the move of casting Heidegger as a thinker who stands in some sort of intellectual tradition originating in Judaism, whose thought in some sense emerges from Jewish sources. So I wanted to share just one passage from a 1952 letter she sends to Jakob Taubes. It's the next passage on your doc. And I'll try to put it on the screen now. So Taubes writes in this letter, the historical obsession, while it's naive and optimistic in Judaism, where it has its source, has driven the Occident into nihilism. and what has happened between the healthy, if crude self-glorification of the children of Israel and the tortured historical mysticism of Heidegger. The history of the Jew in the Occident may be one of torture, but the history of the Occident itself is self-torture. The Jew has a problem only within the Occident. Once at home, he is content with himself. The Occident is problematic to itself. I'm not sure that I fully understand what Taubes is getting at here. I suspect that there are people actually on this call now who could probably help with that. But the basic idea seems to be that Heidegger stands at the end of a development, or maybe a misdevelopment, of an idea emerging out of Judaism. Judaism gives the world some sort of historical obsession, some sort of obsession or preoccupation with existence or participation in history. However, while this obsession was crude yet healthy in ancient Israel, it's become something darker, something more nihilistic in the modern West. And this problematic development is somehow exemplified in Heidegger and his tortured historical mysticism. Again, Taubes's comments remain a bit opaque, again, at least to me. Her reference to Jews being at home outside the Occident suggests a concern with Zionism. In her writings from this period, she's also deeply worried about the state of Israel. Maybe then she's hinting that while Jews are implicated in the modern nihilism they helped originate, they're also able to derive some sort of contentment in their historical existence that eludes Heidegger and others. I'm not quite sure, again, what's going on. However we tease out the nuances, though, Taubes's approach seems to differ from what we encounter in most of Hershkowitz's subjects. Some of those individuals bring Judaism and Heidegger into some degree of proximity, but Taubes seems to go further. She seems to actually cast the former as the source of the latter. So is this then also another story to consider? Is there a story to be told about Jewish thinkers using Heidegger, or is there a story to be told kind of about Jewish thinkers, not just using Heidegger to make sense of Judaism, but also actually casting Heidegger as a product of Judaism? Is there a story to be told about Jewish thinkers actually constructing a genealogy of Heidegger out of the sources of Judaism? So this is my second question. What might we learn if we were to take up Hershkowitz's call to go beyond even the capacious borders of his study? Are there stories that have yet to be told? Are there trajectories that have yet to be explored when it comes to Heidegger and Jewish thought? Okay, so that's question two. And I've already spoken for too long, so let me just try to conclude briefly with one final question. And it's one that has less to do with the stories that the book does or does not tell, and more to do maybe with the lessons the book might offer. Herskowitz is emphatic that his is a work of intellectual history. Nevertheless, the concerns that surface in his account of the past are ones with which we continue to wrestle in the present. To cite just one example, one of the issues that recurs again and again in this book is the question of Heidegger's Christian roots, the question of what sort of debt Heidegger owes Christian theology and what that means for Jewish uses of his thoughts. And again, I think it's worth engaging Hershkowitz's own words here, and they're the last text on the Google Doc, and again, I'll try to magically make them appear on the screen. So this is one of the ways in which Herskowitz poses this issue. Should it at all matter whether Heidegger's philosophy is rooted in or bears the mark of Christian tradition? Would this not be committing a genetic fallacy of rejecting a position because of its origin? Should the question not center on whether or not Heidegger offers a compelling account of human existence, regardless of the sources he draws on? At the same time, however, exposing residues of a certain particularistic heritage in a philosophical account that claims for universality could have the consequence of delimiting its overall cogency. If Heidegger's exposition of the ontological features of human existence is indebted to, or in some way based on, a specific legacy with specific assumptions, then its universality and neutrality is curtailed. So Herskowitz is posing this as a question about Heidegger. If Heidegger's thought is rooted in Christianity, does that matter? If Heidegger's account of human existence is in some sense a covertly Christian one, does that make it any less compelling or any less useful? But as much as this is a question posed about Heidegger, it also resonates with themes that surface in many of our fields today. Those of us in religious studies often find ourselves in debates about the Protestant origins of concepts such as religion and what that means for those concepts. Those of us in Jewish thought often find ourselves in conversations about the Christian origins of notions such as theology and what that means for those notions. My last question then is as follows. To what extent are the issues that come up in Herskowitz's study still with us today? And are there lessons we might learn from the thinkers he examines and cases he explores? Do Jewish attempts to wrestle with Heidegger's secularization of Christian concepts have anything to teach us about our own relationship to those sorts of secularized concepts? Are there other themes that occupy Heidegger's Jewish readers, say a yearning for authenticity, that have contemporary echoes? And do the steps or the missteps of those Jewish interlocutors have anything to teach us today? Kind of put simply, are there conceptual philosophical lessons for the present in Herskowitz's historical excavation of the past? I don't pretend to have answers to any of these questions, but one of the many, many virtues of this wonderful book is that it opens these issues and many others for exploration. With that, I want to again thank Dr. Herskowitz, Dr. Atlas, and my co-panelists, and say that I am excited to learn more.
Were you about to call me Dr. Analyst?
You know, I think I might have, and that can be one of the topics we discuss either now or in other contexts. What
I think you were. That means. Yeah. No. Yeah. All right. Our next participant, who is going to call me by my correct name, I'm assuming, is Professor Vivian Liska. You don't have to. Professor of German Literature and Director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp, Belgium, and she's also the distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Humanities at Hebrew U. She has written just far too many things to actually mention here. It's a voluminous list, and we are lucky to have her speak with us today.
Danke vielmals, Herr Atlas. My little response has a title. It's called Looking for Herskowitz. Having followed the Heidegger and the Jews controversies over the past decades and having alternatingly been outraged, inspired, confused, and fascinated by their provocations, excesses, and convolutions, reading your impressively sound and scholarly book was in many ways a soothing and stabilizing experience. Packed with elegant and scrupulously elaborated documentations, your study radiates erudition, composure, and fairness. Your book has been praised in these terms before, importantly by Stephen Aschheim in the Jewish Review of Books, and rightfully so. Alongside your portrait of Heidegger as the preeminent 20th century philosopher, you acknowledge his failures and political shortcomings, and you present and criticize his disloyal Jewish followers lucidly and with all the due rigor and respect. Your level-headed yet appropriately complex approach yields a coherent, overarching argument supported by strong evidence that captivates, from the initial section dealing with Heidegger's relationship to Christianity to your central chapters discussing Buber, Strauss, Heschel, and Levinas, and your concluding reflections. You clarify the differences and communalities between the Jewish thinkers' approaches to the German philosopher and the role he plays in their respective thought. In your conclusion, you arrive at succinct insights about them as a group. All this is done with a sure hand and sober sophistication. Faced with such balance, I am somewhat bereft of my polemical weapons and am left with little more than genuine praise, quite a few corrections of typos, mainly but not only in German words, and admittedly, an ever so slight irritation with the very equanimity characterizing your study. Your book is no doubt an instructive and satisfying read that delivers what it promises, a lucid representation of Heidegger's Jewish reception and its varied motivations, inspired by what, in your conclusion, you call the self-assertion and advocacy for, quote, the legitimacy of Judaism in the modern world. This conclusion, in which you locate the common denominator of the Jewish Heidegger readings you discuss, diagnoses their, quote, dialectic of attraction and repulsion as their central dynamic. Throughout your study, you convincingly demonstrate that in the eyes of these Jewish thinkers, Heidegger's thought holds the key to the escape from the crises, particularly the Jewish crises of modernity they were struggling with, but that this key needed to be refashioned where it proved to be incompatible with or even inimical to Judaism and Jews. Your closing remarks culminate in the swift quip that for these Jewish thinkers, it is not Heidegger's God, but Judentum that will save us. The almost aphoristic title of this conclusion, to which your quip is the answer, is illuminating. Which God will save us? Heidegger's God from his Spiegel interview or the Jewish God of the Bible? Faithful to the question mark in this concluding title, you don't reply, which leads me to question your question mark. Does it signify your diagnosis of the Heidegger Jewish encounter as a theological competition, your inconclusiveness, an inherent indeterminacy, maybe even a certain skepticism toward both sides? In lieu of an answer, you convey a sense that ultimately the dichotomy itself doesn't hold. These Jewish thinkers' Judaism, you suggest, has too much in common with Heidegger, and Heidegger's thought too much with theirs. After all, he too invokes a God, although it isn't quite a Jewish one. They are, in spite of their contrarian attitude, close enough, so they, Heidegger and these Jewish thinkers are, in spite of their contrarian attitude, close enough for a shared hostility against a flattened, technologized, geistlos modernity. But more importantly, there is, you seem to say, more völkishness, sameness, homeliness in the Jewish thinkers, and more ethics, otherness, and rootlessness in Heidegger than they and many of us may want to know. So what would this undoing of binaries that you call for say about your question mark, one that could be adduced to the question I'm left with? Where, Daniel, are you in all this? Is your disparagement of antithesis, the words are Kafka's, a deconstructive credo, an indecision, an opportunity to dismiss both sides, and if so, for which alternative? A teaser or challenge to your reader, or simply an open question, and thus your historian of ideas' refusal to commit? But are you really only the highly talented, philosophically versed historian of ideas? Is the only criterion of your evaluation, as you state, inner consistency and faithfulness to the text of the other, applied in this case to the Jewish thinker's reading of Heidegger's text? Intrigued, I set out in my search through your book, looking for Herskowitz, or to put it more reverently, asking myself, where in all this, Daniel, dost thou dwell? The surest guide to find you are the pages in your book where your passion flares up. And these also happen to constitute its most powerful passages. Those where you point out the self-serving misreadings of Heidegger perpetrated by the Jewish thinkers. I have benefited greatly from these critical exposés, particularly of Buber and Levinas, and have admired how they literally expose, so these exposés expose the Jewish thinkers' self-contradictions, lacunae, and misrepresentations of the Meister of Meskirch. You have convinced me that they are projections motivated by the Jewish thinkers' own attempts to simultaneously apologetically appropriate, to philosophically feed off and ward off this Meister. So, Daniel, where do these critiques leave you with your Heidegger? This is not how you present it when your critique of Buber, Strauss, and the others states that their sin lies in distorting the master's own letter on the page. But is this possible at all, given your own admonishment that, quote, thought is always situated within a history, community, language, and heritage? So where do you dwell? And do you dwell at all rather than merely chronicle and survey? Maybe one can begin to find you here, in the rhetorical rather than logical figure of drawing a portrait through the misreading of others. Doesn't this in itself create an undeniable bias? If, as you contend, the Jewish thinkers are not only bad readers, but interested ones motivated by their desire to propagate a redemptive Judaism, this critique very implicitly and almost imperceptibly stages a defense of what is misread, thus Heidegger and, I assume, your Heidegger. An example. One of the most forceful pages of the book is page 173, where you sum up the philosophical encounter between Buber and Heidegger. You reject the reductive view of the debate between Buber and Heidegger to the dichotomy between the dialogism of the one and the monologism of the other. You oppose this binary by claiming that for all of Buber's talk of in-between and pluralism, his, and I'm quoting you, dialogical thinking, so his Buber's, dialogical thinking presupposes a monotheistic unity of being, while the monologism of Heidegger, with its interaction between presencing and absencing, and with the ecstatically temporal features of Dasein and language, reveal an unsynthesizable dialogism, a dialectic that cannot promise full transparency or arrival. Heidegger confers an ontology of non-synthesis, while Buber strives for wholeness and higher unity. End of quote. Clearly, what you favor is this unsynthesizable attitude of non-arrival, with its close affinities to the radical dismissal of any closure, echoing a deconstructive indeterminacy. A similar move can be detected in your critique of the established dichotomy between Levinas' own nomadic ethics and Heidegger's Bodenständigkeit, which Levinas associates with Hitler's Blut und Boden ideology. You criticize this approach in insisting that Heidegger's idea of Heimat is not merely the soil of one's land, but a special attunement to being, that it involves, quote, a simultaneity of at-homeness and homelessness, of exile and homecoming, of rootedness and displacement in the Heimat. And hence, you write, it is at once unheimlich and a Geheimnis. This seems to be a rather selective reading of the kind you reproach Levinas to perform. In Heidegger's comments on Hölderlin's Andenken, there is not so much simultaneity as there is a specific, rather familiar dynamic. Time and again, Heidegger describes the modality of Heimkehr and the role of otherness and alterity of going to the Fremde as a detour on the way home. Der Aufenthalt in der Fremde und das Lernen des Fremden, nicht des Fremden, sondern des eigenen Willen. Thus, the turn to the other, the staying in the strange, in the Fremde, occurs not for its own sake, but only for the sake of better and more truly returning home to the familiar, the proper, and the same to one's own. This movement and instrumentalization of the other and of the journey outwards is precisely what Levinas is critical of, and what can hardly be appropriated for the closure-resisting Heidegger you propagate. But there are two more questions that are more central to your book, and I will end there. The one, I detect a slight tautology in the setup of your study. Isn't it self-evident that the Jewish thinkers you deal with fall prey to, quote, Jewish exemplarism? You justify your choice of these thinkers explicitly by saying that you focus on those who approach Heidegger as Jews. So you explain that you don't deal with Arendt because of that reason. So, who all have a stake in Judaism and thus deal with Heidegger from a Jewish perspective, thus almost by necessity promoting Judaism. It seems to me that there is a hint of a vicious circle here. And finally, according to the summary on the book's back cover, you announce your book as a demonstration that the Jewish thinkers you discuss often found Heidegger's work, quote, to be fertile ground for reconceptualizing what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. Your maybe all too convincing critique of Buber, Strauss, Heschel, and Levinas' self-interested and dichotomous misappropriation of Heidegger might yield a rather unattractive and narrow field of vision, and certainly does not bode well for the, quote, meaning of being Jewish in the modern world if, and I still can't be sure that I have found Herskowitz here, this is your view at all. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And we'll end with Shira Billet. She's completing a postdoc in Judaic Studies and Philosophy at Yale University, and she's soon going to begin a position at GTS as an assistant professor of Jewish thought and ethics. Shira is currently writing a book on Hermann Cohen, and we'll have much to say here, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Professor Atlas, or analyst. It's an honor to be here today to celebrate Daniel M. Herskowitz's masterful new book, Heidegger and His Jewish Reception, and to be among such distinguished panelists whose presentations were so wonderful and a tough act to follow. This book is a welcome contribution to modern Jewish thought and intellectual history, fields in which Herskowitz is truly a rising star. Finding a needle to thread together the diverse strands of 20th century Jewish European thought is a rather difficult task. There's the before and after of World War I, the rupture and continuity of World War II and the Holocaust, migrations from Europe to North America and Israel, debates about Zionism versus Jewish emancipation and destiny in the diaspora, the complex Jewish-Christian encounter, just to name a few. In the Jewish reception of Heidegger, Herskowitz constructs a needle that, if I may be permitted to extend the metaphor a bit further, threads these strands together not at all seamlessly, in a way that preserves the individual strands and their tensions with one another and their resistance to being threaded into the needle at all. And that is precisely the point. The Jewish encounter with Heidegger is messy, and Herskowitz's book truly honors the messiness of it. And I'll get back to this messiness in a moment. Herskowitz's book tells us what can only be part of that story of 20th century Jewish European thought, focusing primarily on four major figures and their responses to Heidegger. And we've already heard about them: Martin Buber, Leo Strauss, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Emmanuel Levinas. But this book is about so much more than these four canonical thinkers, because with his characteristic erudition and attention to detail and complexity, Herskowitz constructs for us the intellectual, institutional, and political contexts in which these four figures encountered Heidegger, populating the story with many diverse interlocutors within a diverse and complex intellectual landscape. Despite this rich tapestry, Herskowitz does make the singular and bold claim in the book's preface that, quote, no other philosopher has had more impact on 20th century Jewish European thought than Martin Heidegger. Or as he restates this claim a few sentences later, quote, more than any other thinker, Heidegger's philosophical innovations and challenges marked and fomented 20th century Jewish thought in a profound and indelible way. There is, I would submit, a crucial space that opens up between these two versions of the book's very bold claim. Even if one is not fully convinced of the former, one might still be convinced after reading this wonderful book of the latter. But to return to the messiness of his bold claim, Herskowitz immediately acknowledges that, quote, such a claim may seem odd, even offensive, given the notoriety of Heidegger's biography. I don't love the word offensive, but I find it useful to zero in on here. Herskowitz reminds us of the shameful treatment of his mentor, Edmund Husserl, his political and philosophical support for Hitler, his silence after the Holocaust, and of course, there are the Black notebooks that, as Herskowitz reminds us in the book, are just unavoidable. So yes, in some ways, it really is offensive to claim that this figure was the most important figure for the Jewish encounter for 20th century Jewish thought. And yet, the offensive, what is the offensive, is very complicated, because perhaps it's equally offensive to deny or obscure the ways in which Jews, especially Jews who suffered gravely at the hands of the Nazis and who experienced Heidegger's betrayal most directly, looked at all of this right in the eye and nonetheless agreed with aspects of Heidegger's thought, vehemently disputed aspects of it as well, appropriated aspects of it, as we've heard about already, misread, subverted, transformed others, and formulated their own Jewish response to Nazism in the sense of an answer to the question of why we remain Jews in the 20th century, precisely by way of an engagement with Heidegger's thought. So that was a very long sentence, and just to summarize it, in some ways it would be equally offensive not to uncover this incredible story, as much as it is also offensive, perhaps, that a Nazi was such a central figure for 20th century Jewish thought. While it may offend us that a person with such a shameful politics with respect to Jews turns out to be so important to 20th century Jewish thought, it would, again, be equally offensive to avoid seeing that story. And indeed, as Herskowitz shows in the book, quote, 20th century Jewish thinkers read Heidegger's philosophy as an implicit or explicit religiously charged framework. And as a response, they posited Judaism as the ultimate alternative to it. And we've heard something in the previous panel, in Professor Liska's remarks about what's problematic about this. But there's also a kind of dignity and agency that we recover for the thinkers Herskowitz studies when we see how intentional and agential their encounter with Heidegger was. Feminist philosopher Audre Lorde has famously stated that, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But Hershkowitz's book suggests that this can be much more complicated in certain contexts. Herskowitz shows that antinomies such as German versus Jew, Nazi versus Jew, and even perpetrator versus victim, all examples that he mentions in the book, while important and instructive in many contexts, can also be, and in the case of Heidegger and his Jewish reception, are, quote, overly schematic and ultimately oversimplify the complexity and gravity of the intellectual encounter at hand. While as a responsible intellectual historian, Herskowitz does not extrapolate beyond the time and place and context of his study, one of the things that I find so powerful in this book is that in its methodology, it offers us a method that I imagine can be useful for thinking about our complex encounters with thinkers and texts and sources that are deeply problematic in various ways. A method that acknowledges both our objection to what is wrong and problematic, and also the ways in which we are formed by and also transform and subvert problematic legacies and heritages. So I think I've made it clear by now that I think Heidegger and his Jewish reception is a wonderful book as a work of intellectual history and as a work of scholarship on modern Jewish thought, and that I think it makes an important scholarly contribution by shedding new light on this much debated question of Heidegger and the Jews, and by adding much new material to our consideration of that question. And I also think the book offers a useful method for contending in general with complex legacies, especially complex legacies that have to do with power dynamics between oppressors and those whom they marginalize. With all of this in mind, I beg Hershkowitz's indulgence as I raise a question about the narrative in this book that emerges from my own interests and my own work on Hermann Cohen in relation to what I have already outlined as the incredible merits of this book. Herskowitz notes in the preface, and this theme reappears in several places throughout the book, that the Jewish encounter with Heidegger cannot be understood outside of its original and pre-Nazi context, the Weimar era, and all of the intellectual and political foment of that moment. Herskowitz notes that the Weimar era was a time of, quote, both great promise and great peril for German Jews. On the one hand, it was an achievement, that's the end of the quote. Now back to me. On the one hand, it was an achievement in the long battle for Jewish emancipation, for full civil rights for Jews. Even though Jewish emancipation had advanced at the advent of the Kaiserreich, still many areas of culture and professional life had been closed off to Jews prior to the Weimar era, and now they were opened. There was, quote, an explosion of Jewish creativity, end quote, in all areas of science and culture. There was, quote, indisputable Jewish flourishing, end quote, under the liberal Weimar Constitution. But alongside it, Herskowitz reminds us, was an intense and reactionary conservative, nationalist, anti-Semitic response, one that ultimately led to Hitler's rise. This led to profound disillusionment. The promise of Jewish assimilation into the nation seemed broken. In response, as Herskowitz writes, Jewish politics revolted against the previous generation's assimilationism, turning toward Zionism and socialism and other alternative politics, and, quote, the younger generation of Jewish intellectuals heralded an equivalent revolt against the previous generation's worldview, with its synthesis of Kantianism and Judaism and the more general conflation of Judaism with the values of the Enlightenment, which was so carefully fashioned by 19th century Jewish liberal thinkers and above all by Hermann Cohen, end quote. Cohen is then described as, quote, one of the leading philosophical voices of his generation, who as a Jew was also occupied by the effort of depicting Judaism as compatible with and epitomizing German liberal values and sensitivities, end quote. Herskowitz further writes of Cohen, sorry for so many quotes here, quote, using a Protestant conceptual framework and applying an optimizing idealist hermeneutic to his sources, Cohen knitted the biblical prophets, Plato, Maimonides, and Kant into a narrative of a shared German-Jewish ethico-religious vocation. And he notes that this was a, quote, theoretical construct that, quote, supported the so-called German-Jewish symbiosis. All right, that's the end of my quotes. Revolting against Cohen and his engagement with Kant, Hershkowitz's Jewish philosophers turned to Heidegger as one crucial muse and agonistic counterpart for their own articulation of a Judaism and a being Jewish that fit the 20th century, in Weimar and after the Holocaust too. Of course, Cohen is not the subject of Hershkowitz's book, and it is fair enough for him to repeat the simplistic account of Cohen that many Weimar era Jews themselves gave. But I think that Hershkowitz's book implicitly makes the most compelling case for why we ought to rethink this account of Cohen. Indeed, in many ways, we might see Cohen's encounter with Kant as sharing certain crucial similarities with the encounters with Heidegger of Buber, Strauss, Heschel, and Levinas, and so many others. And we might also see some of these thinkers' encounters with Cohen as perhaps equally fruitful and generative for them, perhaps even in all of the complex ways that Hershkowitz shows us that a generative encounter can be, as their encounter with Heidegger was. Cohen's career took off at a moment that bore uncanny similarities to Hershkowitz's description of what it was like for Jews in the Weimar era. Jews were newly emancipated in 1871. Cohen became the first ordinarius professor of philosophy at a German university in the mid-1870s. Philosophy had been a field that was very much closed off to Jews until then, at least its upper echelons were. And yet, just a few years after this liberal achievement, and indeed within the very same decade, by the late 1870s, reactionary, nationalist, and anti-Semitic forces were unleashed, the likes of which Cohen and other Jews had not seen in their lifetime. Indeed, the term Hershkowitz uses to describe how Jews were perceived by the reactionary forces of the Weimar era as the, quote, German misfortune, was a term first used shortly after Cohen's career launched by the historian Heinrich von Treitschke, to whom Cohen famously responded. Cohen experienced many indignities at the hands of his Protestant colleagues. Some of these are indeed documented in Hershkowitz's book, in his discussion in chapter 2 of the Davos disputation between Heidegger and Cohen's student Ernst Cassirer and its context. The dismissive characterizations of Cohen's entire oeuvre as a mere formal Judaizing of philosophy from Bruno Bach, upon which Heidegger himself drew, are illustrative of such indignities. Cohen's so-called German-Jewish symbiosis, and to return to a line I quoted from earlier in the book, his, quote, knitting of the biblical prophets, Plato, Maimonides, and Kant into a narrative of a shared German-Jewish ethico-religious vocation, these really need to be revisited. Cohen was a much more agonistic and subversive thinker with respect to Protestantism and Germany than this symbiotic account allows. He just had perhaps a different model of subversion, one that I briefly touch on further on in my remarks. Our topic today is not Cohen, and so I can't make the case for this in depth today, nor do I want to, nor would it be appropriate. But instead, I merely want to assert that I do believe Cohen's engagement with German thought was actually much more similar to the reception of Heidegger by the Jews Hershkowitz studies and that he documents than it was to any naive and simplistic and seamless and uncomplicated symbiosis. Just as Heidegger's Jewish readers looked his Nazism in the eye and still found in his thought resources for a fruitful Jewish encounter, one that Hershkowitz even finds problematic and a misreading, an intentional one even in many cases, I believe Cohen did something similar with the German state as it was, with German Protestantism and with Kant. Moreover, I want to briefly suggest that for at least some of Hershkowitz's Jewish readers of Heidegger, Cohen may have even provided them with some of the resources for such an encounter with Heidegger. I'll mention only Leo Strauss, who of all of the figures Herskowitz studies probably had the most profound and lifelong encounter with Hermann Cohen. Just as Herskowitz questioned Strauss's claim to, quote, to have ceased to take interest in Heidegger for about 2 decades, Strauss, in his introductory essay to Cohen's Religion of Reason to the English translation of Cohen's Religion of Reason out of the Sources of Judaism, claims not to have read that book for many years. And yet Strauss repeatedly in several of his important works reiterates a line from that book, that is from Cohen's Religion of Reason, that was clearly very important to him, something that has intrigued many scholars who study Strauss and Cohen. In the context of an explanation of how Cohen could possibly think that the prophet Ezekiel made such a crucial contribution to philosophy, as Cohen argues he did, while also having taken a very significant and problematic step backwards in the prophetic ethos by reinstating the sacrificial cult, Cohen writes, quote, "The philosopher cannot permit the course of history to prescribe for him either the disposition or the solution of his problems. But as little can he prescribe to history the course it should have taken. With regard to the institution of sacrifice, the history of prophecy proceeds in 2 ways. One takes the road of the rejection of the sacrifice. This is a reference to the prophets other than Ezekiel. The other, however, aims at its transformation. The alteration becomes transformation. And it may be asked whether such a transformation is not the best kind of annihilation or abrogation." It's this last line, this sentence, "and it may be asked whether such a transformation is not the best kind of abrogation," that Strauss repeatedly returns to. The model for an encounter with something that is backwards or wrong or bad, that doesn't reject it outright, but rejects it in a way that both accepts and rejects it by transforming it. That's the model that Strauss is preoccupied with. And Strauss writes in his introduction to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, this is indeed the question: whether the loyal and loving reshaping or reinterpretation of the inherited, or the pitiless burning of the hitherto worshipped, is the best form of annihilation of the antiquated, that is, of the untrue or the bad. I could say much more about Strauss's debt to Cohen, including in his turn to Plato and to medieval philosophy, and especially Maimonides. These are things, though, that Herskowitz associates with his encounter with Heidegger, and I think that is a really important insight of this book as well. It's important for us to understand the diverse sources of these aspects of Strauss's thought. But it's quite possible even that Strauss's appropriation of Heidegger's Destruction that Daniel discusses in the chapter on Strauss is related to his reception of Cohen as well. All of this is really not meant to criticize Herskowitz's book for the representation of Cohen in the book, but rather to show how the book itself in its method offers the key for what I think is a better reading of Cohen than the one that those thinkers and their era offered. If we read Cohen's encounter with his problematic Kant in Germany in a similar vein to how Herskowitz counsels us to read the Jewish encounter with Heidegger of the thinkers that he studies, I believe we not only get a better understanding of Cohen, but of what Cohen actually meant for and what his thought generated for many of the thinkers studied in this book as well. And it's for this reason that I believe this book will have even more impact on our field than it already rightfully deserves in terms of its subject matter alone. The book's method helps us see, to return again to the terminology of Audre Lorde's incredible and powerful statement, but one with which I want to play here, that not only might the master's tools actually be used to destroy the master's house under certain circumstances, but it might also allow us to see that there are multiple ways one might destroy the master's house, including by renovating or rebuilding it with different or the same materials, and that the master has many different sorts of tools, including tools the master may not have even known about or ever intentionally used, and that also the very typologies of perpetrator and victim become more complicated when we take a wide enough historical scope to look at a reception history that spans over a long enough period of time to see a shift in the agency and power and the legacies of the different actors in play. Legacies are complicated, and Herskowitz carefully honors that complexity. Herskowitz's book offers us a method for reconsidering the complexities of many such encounters within Jewish thought and beyond. It's a rare feat for a book to be so profoundly well-researched, rigorous, meticulous, historically grounded, and measured in its account and judgment of its particular and specific subject matter, while also offering such a rich and valuable method that is generalizable for a very important type of reception history, the profoundly complex reception that is both negative and positive of problematic texts or thinkers or histories, especially by those for whom that text, figure, and thinker is both most problematic and also most important. So thank you again for this wonderful book and for this wonderful panel.
Okay, after hearing three people praise the book, we've brought Daniel here to trash it. Daniel M. Herskowitz is currently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford. You might know this as well. He's also the author of Heidegger and his Jewish Reception. And he is here to, I don't know what he's going to do actually. Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Shira, for coming together to this event and for reading my book and for thinking about it and for criticizing it. I feel very lucky to have you three as readers of this book. Three careful, sensitive, knowledgeable readers. It's really what. One who writes a book, that this is what you want. You want a serious engagement with your work. Now, three of you just really offered excellent, fascinating points to think about. And what I'm going to try to do now, I'm going to try to touch as many as I can. There are various overlaps, there are various things that I think I could perhaps address together. And yeah, I really look forward to, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts about my thoughts, etc. But first, I really just want to say thank you for this, because this is really a great privilege. I'll start with what I tried to do. So Ellie said that this was a provocative book, and I hoped it wasn't. I tried not to write a provocative book. I tried to write not a sensationalist book, because the topic of Heidegger and the Jews is a provocative one. And it provokes, and there have been so many provocations that I thought, A, the world doesn't need another one. B, I'm not interested in provoking. I'm trying to do just serious research. And three, I thought that the provocation conceals the depth, or what Shira called the dignity and intensity of the encounter between Jewish thinkers and Heidegger. So there were three books I didn't want to write. I didn't want to write a Jews and Nazism book, where everything is reduced to Heidegger's Nazism, and on everything that the Jewish responses relates to his Nazism. That book has been written, and I think that it's not. That a lot more is going on. I also didn't want to write the book that perhaps had I dealt with Susan Taubes, maybe would have emphasized a little more. The book of Heidegger as a Jewish thinker, or the Jewish sources of Heidegger. Now those studies are also already existent. Now I didn't want to write that because I think we need to be very, very careful when we make that argument, because not that one can't make that argument, but one has to be very careful when one does that for a few reasons. First of all, one could very quickly fall back to the Heidegger Nazism. That is, the only reason why Heidegger is treated as a Jewish thinker was because he was a Nazi. And it's basically the other side of the coin of reducing everything to the Nazism. So because of the dichotomy, we try to collapse it into some kind of identity. And, as an intellectual historian, I want to be very careful if I would make an argument, for instance, that there are why can't Rosenzweig, right? People identify Rosenzweig, Protestant streams, or Buber or Cohen, for instance. Why can't they be Jewish thinkers, but Heidegger can? One just needs to be very careful when one makes those arguments. And I mean, recently, this has been a theme, a strand in the research on Heidegger and Judaism, and some of these works are done very, very well, and others I think less so. And the third book that I didn't want to write was the Hannah Arendt book, the ethnically Jewish students of Heidegger responding to Heidegger. And the reason I didn't want to write that was, again, because that book exists many times over. The book I did want to write was a Jewish reception, where Jewish means drawing on and seeing oneself as in some way representing or speaking in the name of Jewish traditions and sources. And in this respect, I think that Vivian is exactly right, that there is a certain circularity. That is, I'd say I'm approaching the thinkers whose lens is colored by Jewish tradition. And I discover that the lens with which they address Heidegger is colored by Jewish tradition. I think that is true, but it's not the whole story, or rather, it's not only circular. And the reason for that is because what I discovered rather quickly when I started this research was that it wasn't just that the lens was Jewish. It was that repeatedly and constantly, these Jewish thinkers, and not only Jewish thinkers, as Eli mentioned, identified in Heidegger various strands, resonances of religious traditions. And these were many. Some just said it's Protestantism, some said Christianity in general, Gnosticism, atheism, dualism, paganism. So these are ways that many of Heidegger's readers, secular, Jewish, Christian, and all the various denominations, understood him. So it's not just Jewish thinkers who think in a Jewish manner, thinking in a Jewish manner, but rather Jewish thinkers who are setting up an encounter, a confrontation between a construction of Judaism and a rival, alternative, spiritual, theological, religious tradition that they identified in Heidegger. Now, of course, I mean, Eli and Shira, Eli mentioned Spinoza and Shira mentioned Cohen as, in some respects, what I wrote, what Eli wrote, what Eli read out in the handout is the blurb of the book, and it's a blurb. It reads like a blurb, and I think you're right. Definitely, you could replace Spinoza's name and Cohen's name, and it would be equally true. But it doesn't mean that the reception is equal. It just means that those general statements could be said equally on Cohen and in a different way, and on Spinoza as the Jewish reception. Now, I think that the difference, a few differences, are I'll mention two because my notes here are a mess. First of all, the story I tell, which begins in Weimar, and I'll try to address Shira's point in a moment. The story I tell is, in some respects, one in which you have a generation of thinkers, German and German Jewish, and part of what the non-sensationalist element, or the non-provocative, I don't know what I try to do is try to understand why some ideas are claimed to be German and some ideas are claimed to be Jewish, even though they sound rather similar. But what's happening in this interwar intellectual environment was a sense of rebellion against the generation beforehand. Now, this happens in non-Jewish circles, and it happens in Jewish circles. And interestingly, not very surprisingly, the turn away from the previous generation of this younger generation is a similar turn towards concreteness, rejection of idealism and abstractness, towards claims of authenticity, this worldliness, etc., existence, etc. Hence, I also was very pleasantly surprised to find that the quotes of Leo Beck, who misquotes Heidegger completely and says something that Heidegger would have never said in a sermon, I think was in synagogue. But he says, yeah, there's this new thinker who's talking about existence, and this is Jewish thought, because that's what Jewish thought does. So there was a turn to a similar direction, an attempt to rethink what it means to be human, what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be a temporal, finite being. And it's to the same direction in non-Jewish world and Jewish world. And the great thinker, the one that automatically you have to address, the one who offered, according to many at the time, the most radical, the most compelling, the most challenging, striking construction of this turn was Heidegger. So the story I try to tell was one that there's a turn to a similar direction, but immediately after Heidegger publishes his book in 1927, 6 years later, all these thinkers, and not only Jewish thinkers, had to suddenly rethink what was going on. They had to rethink their attraction to Heidegger or to this new way of, this new framework, this new way of philosophizing. And it was a great shock. But the story is one of a shared framework, and then the struggle of how do we now account for the fact that we are on the one hand sharing a framework, and on the other hand, we see Heidegger as as evil, as the manifestation of so many of modernity's crises. So those are two different ways in which I think the Jewish reception of Heidegger is different from the reception of Spinoza. First of all, the fact that they are going with this framework that they're sharing with Heidegger. And I think that, Spinoza, it's more of you don't have Jewish Spinozists who are struggling with Spinoza within Spinoza's framework, or within a rather remarkable acceptance of so many of his assumptions, as you have with Heidegger, I think. And the second one is the intensity and the stakes that these Jewish thinkers thought were involved in grappling with Heidegger, because Heidegger was the culmination of a tradition gone bad. Something went very, very bad in Western thought, in modernity, in Europe. And this was encapsulated, embodied in Heidegger. And the fact that he joined the Nazi Party cemented that and kind of vindicated the repulsion or the suspicion. But or I could even add and say that the fact that he joined the Nazi Party, and so many, and now we know Heidegger as well, made that connection between philosophy and politics, that forced these Jewish thinkers, to understand the stakes involved. That is, we need to rethink modernity, we need to rethink philosophy, and because if Heidegger is where we reached, so something has gone very wrong. And again, I think that kind of intensity, the sense that the world is on the line, culture is on the line, civilization is on the line, is represented in the Jewish reception in Heidegger, with Heidegger, and not or less so with Spinoza. Now, when Vivian asked, looking for Herskowitz, so a few things. First of all, I hope that now with my introduction of saying what kind of books I actively tried not to write and what book I did try to write, I hope that there's a little more that you see where I am, where I'm dwelling a little bit more. But I think it's an important point, and I'll say I think two things about that. First of all, it is very much likely that what you are identifying here, you called my book bold, and then also said that you're not entirely sure where I am. And I think that is a fair reading of the dialectic between confidence and lack of confidence of someone who's writing his first book. So I'll just say that on a personal note, that's very possible. But again, I think there's more than that as well. What I try to do, and again, this was mentioned, I insist on being an intellectual historian here, not an unbiased one, not an objective one, but one who is aware of enough research on modern Jewish thought and Jewish reception of Heidegger to be able to make some decisions. And what I tried to do was to demonstrate that this was a serious intellectual encounter. These thinkers didn't just say he was a Nazi, so we could dismiss his thoughts. This was a serious philosophical intellectual encounter. And I tried to highlight that the engagement was also philosophical. It wasn't only, he joined the Nazi party, and it wasn't only he's a pagan, he's a Protestant, he's a secular Christian. It was a philosophical analysis. These thinkers disagreed with his philosophical assumptions, with his analysis of human existence, with his ontological, examination. So this was a serious philosophical encounter, which was also a serious Jewish encounter. And that's what I wanted to present. I wanted to present not a story about Jewish thinkers dealing with a Nazi thinker, but rather Jewish thinkers who are dealing with a profound, problematic, difficult philosopher who, through their engagement with him, were also dealing with broader questions. So it's not only, at least that's what I try to do. I try to show that the Jewish engagement with Heidegger is not only with Heidegger. It has a lot of different ramifications and reverberations. They're dealing with political issues. They're dealing with secularism and the death of God. They're dealing with the rise of technology. They're dealing with totalitarianism. They're dealing with the nihilism, right? Everyone's talking about nihilism. And Heidegger was at the center of all this because of his philosophy and because of his politics. So that's where I am. I'm trying to show this is a serious intellectual encounter with a serious thinker. And here I would add that the fact that I dwelt so much on their misreadings or try to, critically examine their readings is because in a lot of the scholarship, there sometimes is just this confrontational narrative of the Nazi or the German and the Jew. And I think that what was going on actually was a shared framework with a lot of shared assumptions within which these Jewish thinkers were trying to carry on some of the things that they identified as positive in Heidegger, or which they identified and they said was theirs, or identified in Jewish tradition or in other traditions or in the West, humanistic West. And the fact that simply, when you read a critique of a philosopher and it is very much unlike how you read this philosopher, I think it's worth flagging out. I think that a serious work of intellectual history should also evaluate the thinkers that it's dealing with. Now, the evaluation, and I'll add that I think Heidegger is a very serious thinker. And if I agree with him occasionally, if Vivian identified that I'm on his side occasionally, that's probably because it's true. But I also think that he's a problematic thinker, and I also try to criticize his thinking on philosophical and also moral grounds. So it's not like he's the blueprint and everyone else is wrong, but rather there is an intellectual encounter here in which thinkers are trying to construct a positive philosophical program and address the challenge that they identify in the world. Now, this challenge is a different challenge for every thinker. And therefore, the Heidegger, insofar as he embodies the challenge, the crisis, he was read differently according to each different thinker. So for Strauss, Heidegger represents the crisis of truth and historicism. For Buber, it's the inability to reach out to the other, and the closeness and solipsism, and the what I call the monologism. For Jonas, it's the dualism. For various other thinkers, it's secularity, or for Levinas, it's paganism. So Heidegger is identified as the crisis, and these thinkers are trying to deal with it. Now, the fact that they misread him, I'm okay with that. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, but what they're trying to do, the constructive Jewish framework or program that they're trying to form, is one that is happening with Heidegger, but Heidegger is not the alpha and omega of what these thinkers are trying to do. He's a central he's a sun around which they orbit. He's not the only thinker they're reading. He's not the only thinker they're addressing. And their program can and should be thought of also outside of just orbiting around Heidegger. So I noted this very in brief and politely, but none of these thinkers are Heidegger's children, in the sense of struggling and failing to get out of his totalitarian or problematic grip. So that is where I am. That is where I am, trying to show a complex and serious story that involves misreadings, and that is one of a struggle, which is where my attempt to kind of deconstruct the dichotomies at the end comes. Because I think the story is one that, on the one hand, you have to attack Heidegger. He does represent the crisis. On the other hand, the crisis and the alternative, the problem that you're trying to remedy. On the other hand, they all granted that he was a very serious thinker, and they all came out of the same world that he did. And he was a central figure in this world. So that is a story that I tried to tell. Now to Shira's point about Cohen. And I think all I just try to say now was, Shira got it exactly right when she said the dignity and intensity. So I think it's a dignified attempt, even if I think that, they often misread Heidegger. I think it's a dignified encounter and it was an intense one. Now, I completely accept Shira's framing and her question, in the sense that I accept that my framing is too indebted to the way in which this generation perceived itself as a break and rebellion against the generation of the past. And that was the story I told. Now, to my defense, I'll say that this is how these thinkers conceptualize their own thoughts. This is how Heidegger conceptualized his own thoughts. So he rejected neo-Kantianism and this bourgeoisie, stable, liberal, cosmopolitan, urban world that he identified the Kaiserreich as, and he definitely identified Cohen and Kassir's Jews as, being manifested as, right? He was very much in this kind of reactionary vision of Judaism as universal, liberal, urban, modern, technological, etc. So the story I tell is a story that the way that these thinkers perceive themselves, but I agree that this story too should be critically examined. And that as a whole, and I think this is also maybe could be seen in the book, as a whole, I believe more in continuities in ideas than discontinuities. Often I think that when people claim discontinuity, it's often rhetoric for justification. And that you but you often build on, criticize, reject on the basis of logic of the position that you're rejecting. And so I definitely accept that. And I would very much be interested to hear more what you have to say on Strauss and Cohen, Because if Strauss's reaction to Heidegger is similar to Strauss's reaction to Cohen, that would be very interesting, and that would also give more weight to your argument that actually a similar story could be told from a generation beforehand. I think I've been going on for quite a while. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here, and just thank the three speakers again, and thank everyone who came to listen to us.
Okay, so before we open it up to anyone and everyone, does anyone want to respond to Daniel, sort of Thunderdome or duel style? You can challenge to a duel, that would work very nicely.
I just want to say that I found your response, Daniel, your response is excellent. And you've convinced me about many things that I liked about your book, and that I like even more now, because there is something in the way you spoke now. I realized that my ever so slight irritation at you not coming out was not a way of hiding, but I really liked what you said about the being, like, taking up my comment of you being both bold and not not going for your thought. I think that you did a wonderful job in responding in that way. I felt at some point that there was something just simply authentic in the way you did this, if one may still use this word in the context.
Thank you.
Can I briefly pick up on just one aspect of what Vivian just said, which has to do with the boldness of your argument? I really appreciated, Daniel, your kind of opening remarks on how you tried to avoid, you began by saying you tried to avoid provocation. You then moved to talking about avoiding sensationalism. And I actually think that's a really important distinction when it comes to your book. One of the great virtues of your book is that I think it really does avoid any kind of sensationalism. It both in terms of its tone, right? It adopts the sort of calm tone that lowers the reader's temperature, and it also in terms of the content, it walks us through the material so carefully that it's hard to get up in arms by the end, right? You've convinced us. I'm not sure that means the book is not provocative, though. I actually think you undersell just how bold your argument is. And I'll just give 3 examples. In your response, you just suggested that much of scholarship on Heidegger and Judaism is at best incomplete and at worst sensationalist and obscuring. Right, you suggested that you raised just in your comments now some pretty serious concerns about the kinds of conversations we have had as a field about Heidegger and Judaism, Heidegger and Jewishness, Heidegger and Nazism. I think that's implicit in your book. That's provocative, right? You're really calling the field in a respectful and nuanced way to task. I also think your treatment of the thinkers is itself provocative. I mean, if we agree with your reading, and I think we should, basically in important ways, everyone from Buber on gets Heidegger wrong, even though they're deeply concerned with him. That's provocative, right? To tell a story of much of modern Jewish thought as being animated by philosophical misreadings, there's something productively provocative about that. This maybe connects not just to what Vivian was saying, but to what Shira was saying. Your treatment of German Jewish liberalism is provocative. You have this wonderful paragraph where you basically say that the structure of the German Jewish liberal response to Heidegger, exemplified in Cassirer, first, ends up being very similar to the structure of the kind of response to Heidegger in these critics of German Jewish liberalism, right? For all that Buber and Levinas and Heschel and Strauss would have lots of concerns about German Jewish liberalism, you make a really compelling case that at least on the level of structure, at least on the level of form, they are reenacting the legacy of the German Jewish liberalism that they try to overcome. That's provocative as well. So I guess this is a long way of saying that I really appreciated your emphasis on not being sensational, but I think you can, at least as I read it, and you can disagree, I think you can own the provocation, because I think the provocation, you've in your response now made the case that the provocation is something we need as a field, and that we particularly need when we talk about Heidegger and Jewishness. We can talk about Spinoza maybe in another context, but I did just want to sort of talk about that provocative versus sensational distinction.
I'll just say briefly that I too was moved by the authenticity, if we may use that word. I had the same question of the response, and I guess the only thing I would want to leave us with is that I think that where Vivian landed in terms of what at first seems like a problem, maybe this kind of boldness and simultaneously the absence of the figure of the author as front and center of the book, that where Vivian landed as seeing that actually as a virtue in terms of how you described it. And I would just say, Daniel, you said maybe that's only because it's your first book, but maybe more subsequent books should be like a first book. I do think a book that can be both bold in its claims, but not about the author, there's something actually really wonderful about that. So thank you.
Thank you for these comments. I'll have to think about what I think about being provocative. I want to, I mean, just to respond to Ellie's points very briefly, because I want to hear from other people as well. I think, I mean, incomplete. You said incomplete or sensationalist. Sensationalist, I put on the side of reducing a rich and diverse encounter to politics and to Nazism. That I think is not serious or interesting, because it doesn't matter what Heidegger or what the Jewish thinker said. You already know what the conclusion is from the start. You already know that it's about Nazism, and Heidegger is a Nazi, and they are, the good guys, and that's been done so much, so often, and for decades, because every single time there's some new revelation, it all erupts again. So that I think is no longer interesting. I said that there's a lot of good work on Judaism and Jewish responses to Heidegger. I draw on it in my book, obviously. What I try to do is something that is not constructive, right? I try to capture what I think, to the best of my ability, to capture a moment and how it unfolds, and the difficulty of Heidegger's challenge, and the difficulty of doing modern Jewish thought in the 20th century. And here maybe I could pick up on something that Eli said now and in his first remarks, and Shira as well. I mean, it's a difficult task to carve out a space and to articulate a voice when you're a minority in a general context, when there are, we're always already part of traditions, and there are, I mean, everything has an archaeology, and ideas are forward-looking, they're futural, but they also have a past. And to the extent that there is some kind of discourse of authenticity in this 20th century Jewish tradition, it's difficult. It's difficult, and that's what my attempt to deconstruct the binaries try to show. Not that Heidegger and these Jewish thinkers are actually saying the same thing, but rather that there is a struggle. How do you articulate an alternative how do you give a voice, a relevant voice to your tradition, where you identify, where the remedy, where the challenge that you try to solve is one that you in some respects share a conceptual horizon and assumptions with. So I think if that says anything about what it means to do research on Jewish studies, on modern Jewish studies or Jewish thought nowadays, maybe that's what I would have to say. That that it's not easy, and that again, I mean, as I said, I don't mind them misreading Heidegger, and also I don't mind. I mean, whether or not someone is disturbed by various theological charges or a theological past, that depends on your specific kind of presuppositions of what constitutes Jewish thought.
Oh, I'm muted. Well done. Okay, so does anyone have anything crueler to say? Everyone has been sort of disappointingly kind. So I guess here we open it up to the general public in the hopes that we can find some viciousness among you. No, with all seriousness, does anyone have any questions? I believe Allison, are you able to unmute yourselves now, people?
Dustin, I think you didn't listen properly. I don't feel concerned when you said that everybody was so kind.
I don't think
there were criticisms, but the general affects and like sort of relationships, there was a lot of praise. It's I wish I'd like more knives. No, I listened carefully. I'm a never-ending well of terrible jokes.
Dustin, are we only allowed to criticize Daniel, or can we criticize you as well? I just want to get the sense of what this kind of scope.
Anything is fine. I don't care about the target. I'm mildly disappointed that no one made fun of Daniel for hiding himself and suggested there might be a good reason that he wouldn't put himself in his book. But that's an opportunity passed. Who would like to go first? I see Aubrey, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. And Daniel, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Sorry that my camera's off, but I'm giving you a high five. A couple things just in terms of response. I haven't had a chance to do a full reading of the book yet, but maybe you could just let us know, for those that need to do a deep dive into the book that haven't had the chance, like the other speakers, to do a full reading yet, whether you address, you referred in general to the scholarship on Heidegger and Jewish thinking, the two seminal studies of Elliot Wolfson, both Heidegger and Kabbalah, as well as the duplicity of philosophy shadow, and how that works into or does not work into the project of your rethinking. And then the other one is really just a comment about a footnote, which you probably already know, but for others that may not know, the Susan Tabas question is already being responded to in a certain way, again, by Elliot Wolfson. He has a forthcoming manuscript that tackles that. But I am interested to hear the particulars of how you do address or not address that in terms of this project of rethinking, because it seems to me like that would be a pretty important precedent to engage with.
Okay, and if no one minds, what I'm going to do is have a few questions asked so Daniel can sort of pick and choose rather than just sort of one. So next, Ezra.
Hi, so Daniel, thank you for this amazing book. I also have to admit I'm a third of the way through it. What I wanted to do is someone who does both Islamic thought is let's have you reflect, even though you don't want to be normative or maybe even prescriptive with this book, what lessons do you think other traditions like the Islamic one, sort of outside of the Judeo-Christian horizons of the West, what lessons do you think religious intellectuals of other traditions can glean from the way Jewish thinkers have dealt with Heidegger and your assessment of his legacy, both for the thinkers themselves and for scholars that look, for example, I've read scholarship on the reception of Heidegger in Iran. So what lessons would you say for other scholars investigating Heidegger reception, and then for normative thinkers themselves who are not Jewish and perhaps even not Christian.
Okay, great. And then one more, let's go with Caitlin. All right, Caitlin, I don't know if you're talking. We can't hear you. If you can't make it through,
Oh,
you can
apologies. My microphone was on mute. I was just curious to the Buber connection to Heidegger. I know Mordecai Kaplan had studied philosophy at Columbia University, and he also was very deeply interested in Buber's philosophies. I'm wondering, through that chain of connection of Buber to Heidegger, if you know how Heidegger may have influenced Reconstructionism and American Judaism in general.
All right, that's three very different, very powerful questions. So let's not drown Daniel in any more and give him that to work with.
Thank you, Aubrey, Ezra, and Caitlin. Yeah, three very different questions, three difficult questions. I'll start with the first. Elliot and I are invested in different projects and wrote very different books. I see Eliot as a constructive Jewish thinker. He's a scholar of Kabbalah and a philosopher. And I think his recent two books that you mentioned, which are actually one book, because he published the Duplicity of Philosopher's Shadow because he felt he had to as an introduction to Heidegger and Kabbalah. That project is a comparative and constructive one. And whenever he comes close to historical claims, he backs down. He backs up because he's not interested in historical claims of influences or where these ideas come from, or the strands of influence and stuff like that. He's interested in the comparison, in the phenomenology, and how Kabbalistic traditions and Heidegger shed light on each other, both positive and critical light. And I think, if Elliot Wolfson would be chapter one, say, of a book of Heidegger's 21st century Jewish reception. So I think Elliot, to the best of my, I have to think about this more, but to the best of my knowledge, is the first Jewish thinker who criticizes Judaism from a Heideggerian perspective. Because, he has some critiques of Jewish traditions within Kabbalah there. But he doesn't, I think, care for the historical argument. And this brings me back to what I said at the beginning, responding to Ellie's the Susan Taubes question, the third question. When one does these kind of Heidegger as a Jewish thinker, you need to be very careful. You could do it comparatively, and then you're judged according to that methodology. And I think Eliot's book is an excellent book. But you can also claim that Heidegger is a Jewish thinker and actually simply mean the true but also banal claim that there are Christian strands in Heidegger's thinking, and Christianity is based on Judaism. And therefore you just chose to start, where you identify the roots earlier, but Heidegger got it from Christian channels, or, Christian, Kabbalistic strands within Schelling and those things. So, if you make the historical argument, it's probably true. You could identify all kind of Jewish resonances within Heidegger, but I think it wouldn't be too much of an interesting argument beyond the fact that in the background there's always the fact that he was a Nazi, and therefore that is a provocative or sensationalist. I'll have to decide later on. So as to my answer is, we're doing something very different. And I mentioned Eliot, as a footnote, as someone who is doing a Heidegger Judaism project that is not mine, not my own, about what lessons can different traditions like Islam think about this Jewish reception. That is an excellent question, and I struggle to even know how to begin answering it. I'm aware of a Heidegger's reception in Iran. I didn't read. I think there's articles or maybe a book. I'm not familiar with it. I suspect it would be very different because of the different role that Jews perceive themselves and occupied within Europe and Christianity during the 20th century. At least that's the period I'm focused on. So I think it would be very, very different. I don't know. I mean, one can find liberating aspects in Heidegger. The Jewish reception that I tried to survey didn't, but I think one can, if one wants. As to Heidegger's influence on Reconstructionism and American Jewry, I was hoping you were going to ask about Heidegger and Buber. That would have been easier to read, to respond to. And I have an article cooking on Heidegger's critique of Buber, because he doesn't address him a lot, but he does criticize him in some lectures in the 20s. I wouldn't say that. I would be very surprised if we could identify some kind of influence or something like that coming from Heidegger on Reconstructionism. I also want to add that Heidegger was not the only thinker thinking about these questions. He was maybe the central one, definitely in the perspective of all these thinkers, but he wasn't the only one. There was, right, it was, as I said, it was a generational turn. And to trace influences, which is a term I really dislike, back to Heidegger, we would have to be able to make a better case than just an attraction to Buber or something like that. So that's what I have for those three questions.
Okay, it sounds good. Anyone have any? We're going to end soon, but does anyone have any final questions? Thomas Froy is asking what you're working on next, which is a terrifying question to ask somebody. Does anyone else have a question? I wonder, in terms of just the misreadings that you focus on, it does seem that in the early 20th century, you were just allowed to misread people aggressively. Like Heidegger's own readings are actually quite questionable. And then the 80s, we valorized it and decided misreading was actually the greatest thing, or all reading was a misreading. But I guess part of what I wonder is it a misreading when we're dealing with so few, they're dealing with so many fewer sources than we're dealing with, right? I mean, the Heidegger section in the bookstore is voluminous, but a great deal of it is recent. So that I'm just throwing in there. Does anyone have any serious questions? Bueller, nobody? And you're all about to fall asleep, I suppose. So yes, I mean, I guess that's my question is like, so I don't want to say you seem more critical of the interpreters of Heidegger misreading him than his own sort of very strange readings of other texts. But I'm wondering if there's something more to be said about misreadings other than just they were appropriating him according to a certain project, whether or not it's part of the milieu generally. Also, in terms of your Spinoza thing, and maybe this is just because Eli's also written about Mendelssohn, it does strike me that Mendelssohn actually meets most of those criteria of functioning within a Spinozist frame. Pantheism he did view as an extremely dangerous force vis-a-vis Judaism, and misread blah blah blah, but who knows? Anyone else? Nobody?
Maybe I'll respond to your question while perhaps
yeah, sure.
I just say that I notice that of course we have a better perspective on Heidegger's writing and philosophy than the thinkers in the book had, and And when I critically examine their readings, I also note that, like, Buber, he couldn't have known what we know now in light of the Black Notebooks, etc. There were still things that were published by Heidegger and enough for them to use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually really interesting how the spur of publications of Jewish thinkers in engaging with Heidegger, criticizing him, is exactly, a year after Heidegger publishes something. So there's nothing throughout the war because Heidegger doesn't write anything at the war except for a few analyses of Hölderlin, which a year later Buber criticizes. And then in the 1950, or end of 1950, Heidegger publishes a set of lectures, and then 1952, everyone is responding to Heidegger. Now, is there more to these misreadings? I think that Heidegger is a very difficult thinker, and he's not always a consistent thinker. And of course, everyone approaches his thinking with their own specific lens and bias. What I tried to avoid, I have in mind a specific article on Buber and Heidegger that presented it as Buber is offering an authentic Jewish response to this German Nazi thinker. And I think that is an unfair way of characterizing what was going on. And I think that it impoverishes our understanding of this reception. So that's why the emphasis on analyzing their analysis rather than just presenting their critique was an attempt to show this isn't just they are criticizing Heidegger, and they're always criticizing with an implicit higher moral ground because of course they are, right? So automatically it becomes normative, not because it's not normative, it is normative, but the normativity of it doesn't mean that we should get a thinner understanding of what's at stake. In terms of Mendelssohn and Spinoza, that's we'll talk about that later. But again,
that's an overdrinks talk.
Yeah, it's also very, very possible that that's the case. If we don't have another question, so I'll just say what I'm working on, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, it's nice. We'll end it. It's forward-looking. The future is bright and open, and everyone can smilingly go back to their days.
Right. So I'm working on a book on Rosenzweig now, and reading Rosenzweig in light of the theological world around him. That's my current project.
Okay, that's wonderful. I have another annoying question about Derrida, but I'll ask you that later. So anyone, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you especially to our panelists, Daniel, and in the background, Allison, who has been pulling all the levers and doing all the organizing and emailing, so especially to her. And thank you, all of you, for coming and taking time out of what maybe will be a sunny day if Ezra's camera has to go by. Here it's dreary, so this is easy for me. But for those of you who have resisted the sun, I want to thank you very deeply.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And Dustin, thank you for organizing this, and Allison, thank you.
Can everyone do a silent Zoom clap? That weird thing that everybody does. There we go. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and all of you take care. Very good, Sam. That's a great Zoom clap. That is top notch.